right. It is 10 o'clock.
All right.
Who is Julia's today, correct? Julia Ostro?
Yes, it is I. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Would you like
I was so moved by what Adria shared yesterday and what Jacob shared Monday, and today I thought I could pick up on Adria's outro from yesterday, which this is Ma Tovu, which includes, I think it's verse 7, a line that from Psalm 5. So I think but you, well, actually, I don't have the, oh, here it is. Sorry, I was looking at something else. If we, so Va'ani Barov Chastecha. So that's
Right.
That's 7 from Psalm 5, and I was thinking about the Danny Mussing setting, which I think is what Adria played yesterday, and it's just meaningful because this liturgy and this setting, which we've sung so many times at CBST, here is the source text that we're learning from now. So this is a setting that many of us know, so please sing along. Ma tovu, ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, ma tovu, ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, va'ani berov chastecha avo betecha, אשתחווה על קודשך ביראתך, מה טובו, מה טובו, אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך Israel. And those initial, the Matovu verse, of course, is from Numbers.
Thank you so much, Julia. Absolutely, that this is an example of this one verse from this particular psalm. All of Matovu are made up of verses, that whole piece are made up of verses taken from different parts of the Tanakh and from a few different psalms. And in the CBST Siddur, if you have it, we were very careful to mark to give the citations for biblical prayers that are formed by combining different verses from different sources of the Bible. So what Jacob Nimi did, for instance, of taking two verses from two different psalms is a very classic thing to do to create Jewish prayer. And Ma Tovu, now, and you can see, if you look back at the text, why would the composer of this prayer have taken this verse? The first line of Ma Tovu is talking about living in or creating beautiful sacred space, and we have the reference to the Ohalecha, the tents, Mishkan Kvodecha, the dwelling places in this verse, has the reference to wanting to Va'ani berov chastecha avo beitecha, into your home or house, and El Heichal. So it's all different verses that refer to coming into God's place and the idea of there being sacred space that we would enter. So that's the theme that you'll see in the different verses. But yes, this verse is super famous in the world of famous psukim, and it's buried here in Psalm 5, which is not a particularly famous psalm. Going back to some of the conversation yesterday about the repetition, I do have to say that you'll develop. I love the repetition and of the repetition of saying Psalms. And some of the Psalms mean more to me than others. That's just the natural way of things, right? Like over time, some have become my personal favorites, but it's not that I only will say my personal favorites. Sometimes I do, but I also like saying them in the midst of the texture of all of them. And then I think, oh, here comes a personal favorite. It's a little bit like going to an art museum. Maybe, and you just love looking at the art, but you have a couple that, oh my God, when you visit that particular piece, you feel it maybe evokes things from a different time of your life, or it just has some special meaning. It doesn't mean you don't like the other art in the museum, and it doesn't mean you only will go to visit that particular painting or that particular piece of art. Although maybe sometimes you do, but somehow it's special in the context, if you know what I mean, if that makes sense to you. I wanted to point out the book that we're going to add for some of the Psalms. We're going to look at the translations. I mentioned this woman, Gaia Bernstein, who is a doctor, a medical doctor, and an Orthodox Jewish woman, I think from the Upper West Side. She wrote, honestly, Psalms like what all of you are writing, personal Psalms, but she comes from an Orthodox background. So it'll be interesting to see how that brings. But I wanted to read from her introduction to all of you as an example of what Psalms mean for her. So I'm just going to read this opening paragraph. As I sat in the hospital waiting room shortly after my young daughter was diagnosed with lymphoma, I had a strong visual memory of a woman reading Psalms. Her son was my patient. He had a brain tumor and he did well. He lived and then married. I remembered that when her son was going through medical tests, she always sat silently reading, praying from the Hebrew book of Tehillim, Psalms. It had surprised me because in high heels and slacks, she didn't look like the type. I remembered that her son lived and did well. During those socked in the gut first days of my child's diagnosis, I put a book of Psalms in my bag and I kept it with me. I read Psalms during the PET scans, during chemo, during insomnia. It was all I could read for months. I read Psalms in Hebrew and in English. I tried to make each Psalm relevant to my torment. David's enemies became my child's cancer cells, impotent against the Almighty. David's faith in the power of prayer became my faith. I found comfort in the Psalms with their raw and unflinching depictions of the human condition and their intimate first-person conversations with an inconceivable God. So I thought that was a great description of someone's use of Psalms and relationship to them. And so we're going to look at some of hers as well, and maybe even we'll get to it today. So I just wanted to make sure, see if anybody had any comments following up on our conversation yesterday, and then we'll go back to the Psalm itself.
Let me see. Rabbi, Sarah Siegel asked a question.
Yes.
Which I'll pose. She said, who decided, or when did we decide which Psalms went into the liturgy? Whether it's the full Psalm or whether, like Matovu, it's just a line or two.
Well, that's a whole big topic, kind of like what we went when we got into the Lenin and the Aleppo codices, I think is the plural.
Codices, yes.
Codices, thank you. So that goes to the question of who created our Siddur, really. How did the Siddur come to be? How did Jewish prayer get created? And it wasn't created in one moment by one person sitting down and making a decision. And that it's more recent, we have some more information than we do about the biblical codification, which books of the Bible became part of the Bible, which books did not become part of the Bible. A lot of that is quite mysterious because how long ago it all happened. We have some guesses, but we don't entirely know. Even people who say they know, there's only so much we could possibly know, given how little exists. The creation of Jewish prayer, of a Siddur, has happened a little bit more recently, so we have some more information about some of it, but also the real origins are hard to tell, but that is a whole class in itself, and maybe I'll spend, if people are interested, a day on that someday, but let me say it briefly now. We know, of course, that in the times of the Bible, prayer was not the primary way that Jews worshipped or celebrated a holiday or celebrated Shabbat. The primary way that the biblical religion existed was by offering sacrifices in the temple. So if it was Passover, if it was Shavuot, Sukkot, there were things that Jews did, but primarily it wasn't prayer. We sounded the shofar, we know, for instance, on Rosh Hashanah, but we also offered sacrifices. Shabbat was about sacrifices. Yom Tov was about sacrifices. And we only know when the temple was destroyed. In Rabbinic Judaism, we're told that prayer replaces sacrifices. So instead of a morning, afternoon, and evening prayer, we offer morning, afternoon, evening sacrifices. We offer morning, afternoon, and evening prayer. So that prayer itself is a replacement for sacrifices. And so we know that there was personal prayer in the Bible, because we hear about different characters praying to God personally, like Hannah when she was praying for a child, or Moses praying for Miriam when she was sick, Pli elna rafanallah. But these were personal prayers that people would pray. Communal prayer, we don't know exactly when it started. So we have a sense that it started around the time of the destruction of the temple, but probably earlier than that, not 70 of the Common Era, probably a little earlier than that, because we know that there were some early synagogues at which we know there was reading of Torah. So there was probably some prayer. The Shema is probably one of our oldest prayers we know about that. So then the question becomes, how did all these other prayers, words and words and words and words and words develop? It was really ultimately a process of accretion. Every generation would get added things, and that's why some of our services are so long. People didn't like to edit anything else anybody had done, but they wanted something new. So guess what happens? A new thing gets added. So the development of prayer, first of all, Ashkenazic Sidurim are different than Sephardic Sidurim, that the order of the prayers are not all the same, and even some of the content of the prayers are not the same. So if you're from an Ashkenazic tradition, you have to know that what we pray could be, as Ashkenazic Jews, is sometimes quite different than what a Sephardic Jew prays, or what Jews from Rome pray. Roman Jewish tradition for prayer is completely different than either Ashkenazic or Sephardic, because it predates the diaspora itself. So how crazy is that, huh? That it doesn't, when the Roman Jewish nusach is different than everything altogether. So that's the big context to understand. So as prayers got written, it happened in different places and in different times throughout Europe. So some of our prayers, for instance, come after the period of the Crusades, when Jews were in terrible trauma. Some of the prayers come from the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and we have them actually inside of the Mishnah and the Talmud. A rabbi will say, this prayer is X, Y, or Z. But we have one of the oldest Sidurs we have, just like we have the Lenin Codex and the Aleppo Codex, so we look to them for what was in them to know what Jews were doing. We have a couple of very old Sidurim. And so when we want to know what was done, there's a very famous Sidur called the Sidur of Rav Amnon. And we look at that Sidur to know, and I've forgotten what year that's from, but I could look that up. So probably around the year 700, 800, 900, 1000, a lot of our basic prayers were composed. And then later in the medieval period, a lot of things got added. And it was different. We don't necessarily know who actually wrote some of them, although some we do. For instance, what's our famous one? Lecha Dodi, we know was what period of time it came out of, and and what it was written, and we see the acrostic for the name. But most of them we don't have individual names for. But interestingly, Roseanne Leipzig's, I think it was her cousin or her uncle, now I'm not sure, maybe it was her cousin, is one of the most famous scholars of Jewish prayer, Reuven Hammer. And he has wonderful books, both on a scholarly level and on a popular level, kind of analyzing the evolution of Jewish prayer. And probably that's the right word. It evolved. It didn't just plop down. The Siddur didn't just plop down all as one. And if you are interested in this, I definitely can talk more about it. I have to look up some of these dates because I don't have them in my head loosely, to call from, but that's the overall arching. But throughout the Mishnah and Gemara, you see the rabbis there pulling a verse from a psalm and combining them in all different ways. So it is an ancient Jewish practice to do this, to find a verse, pull it out, put it with another verse. And it's called, in Talmud study, it's called, not to load you up with a lot of different phrases, but it's something in Talmud study called Gezerah Shava, which means if there's something similar from one psalm to the next, you can learn something about the psalm. So not just psalm, verse, but they do it a lot with psalm, verses from the psalm. So Gezerah Shava means, wow, there's a word in the Matovu about place, right? Matovu ohalecha, your tents. So a Gezerah Shava would be in the verse from Psalm 5. There's a word about Peitecha, your house. There's a Gezerah Shava about ohalecha, your castle or your ornate house. So a Gezerah Shava is and that's for a poetic combination, but the rabbis use Gezerah Shava even for a halachic. So they'll say, just like it says in one verse, this word, we find this word in that verse, and therefore X, Y, or Z. So that is a very profound, so it's called Gezerah Shava, and it's a very profound rabbinic way of studying text. So this idea of combining things because there's a theme or even a word in one that can combine with another is like part of the rabbinic play of language. Okay, how are we doing? Was that too intensively?
It was wonderful.
Okay,
all
right.
Can I just say that I asked about it because I told you I'd gone to day school, but I had no experience with Tehillim other than what got stuffed into a prayer,
Exactly.
our tefillot. So, and I just want to go back to days and days ago. I asked you, so what got you attracted to the Psalms at 15? And I was projecting when I asked that question. I said, I think I know why. And I assumed it was because they were comforting you when you were figuring out that you were a lesbian. This was my imagination. I didn't get to the Psalms until you were ill and we were asked to say a psalm. I had never even exposed myself to that. This class is a miracle to me because I really, I wouldn't have known otherwise. Thank you.
I think for me, it wasn't just the coming out issue for me at 15. It was more the general teenage trying to make sense of my life altogether. I don't think it was only that specific. It was much bigger. I was full of angst as a teenager about the meaning of life and becoming Orthodox, and my family was, so I don't think for me it was that specific. It was part of a bigger adolescent angst. But as I've matured, the Psalms have matured. Isn't that amazing?
Wow.
How that happens? They're no longer just about teenage angst for me, although they very much responded to that teenage angst. They've remained, as hopefully I've matured. It's amazing how the Psalms have matured.
So Rabbi, your call, we have a few hands up, or we could go to a translation, whatever
let's have a couple of hands up, and then because I had to cut everybody out.
Send your hand up for 10 minutes now.
Hi, Rabbi. I going back to what you read in the beginning, about that translator wrote about seeing people sitting, reading Psalms by their next to people who are sick. Last fall, I forget what the word is, but I sat with the body of a wife of a friend of mine, so his family and friends could all leave the home, and I forget what the word is, but
Mira, or to be a shomer.
Yes, the shomer. Yeah, it was actually a good friend of Elizabeth Wilson, and she suggested I bring the Psalms because I was like, I've never done this before, and which was nice to hear because I love the Psalms, and it ended up. It was about 4 or 5 hours, and it was really difficult. It was much more difficult than I expected, but
it's a long time to have to do it.
Yeah, and it's a mom. She was a mom, with a kid not much older than me, and so anyway, I just sat there and read Psalms out loud to her dog and myself and whoever's listening. But I was really curious to know if there's certain Psalms that you know, in a moment like that, that not that you're supposed, maybe you're supposed to read, or that bring more.
So that's a great question. And it brings out, that's a really, we forgot to say that in the very beginning when we talked to the different times that Psalms are said, or maybe we didn't, I don't remember. Shmirah, which means the guarding. When somebody dies, from the moment of death to the moment of burial, it's traditional for some to maintain shmirah, like to be a guard, to provide guarding for the body until the body's returned to the earth. And for instance, when my mother died in September, we had a shomer. We paid for somebody to sit by her body for the time between death and burial. And what he does the entire time is sit there and recite the whole book of Psalms over and over again. CBST has sometimes provided shmirah for some of our members. And we've encouraged people to read anything, but just to read something. Sometimes people brought books of poetry or the newspaper or a book they loved, and just to sit there and just read out loud to maintain this presence of holiness. So that's absolutely a time. For shmirah over a person who has died, it's traditional to just go through the whole book. There are specific psalms that are said to have particular power around illness. And then the Bratslav Hasidim, for those of you who know about Bratslav, and this is a whole other topic, I wasn't going to talk about this till we get to one of these psalms. Bratslav has the Bratslav Rebbe, who died in the early 1800s, and his community did not replace him as a Rebbe. So they're called the dead Hasidim because they worship a dead Rebbe. The Bratslav Hasidim, he offered 11 psalms that he believed had particular power when they were recited in order, and they called that a tikkun of these 11 psalms. And so for Bratslav Hasidim, those 11 psalms have particular power, and they will recite them in the order they are when there is a moment of danger or illness. And so for Bratslav Hasidim, these 11 psalms have particular power. It's very interesting because if you look at them, it's hard to really totally understand. They're not, if I were to choose 11 psalms, those wouldn't be the ones I would choose, but I'm not the Bratslav Rebbe. So for Bratslav Hasidim, those 11 psalms mean everything. And by the way, for those of you, is Ruth Berman on today? I don't know if Ruthie is here today, but Ruth's partner, Connie's son, is a Bratslav Chassid who lives in Tiberias in Israel. And he's a Bratslav Chassid and a lovely, lovely, wonderful human being. Several of our trips to Israel, he came down to Jerusalem to meet with Ruthie and Connie and to meet the whole congregation that was there. It was really lovely. But for Bratslav Hasidim, which are a very particular type of Hasidim, and they're very famous for these 11 psalms. Some years ago, Rabbi Simcha Weintraub, who runs the Healing Center, took those 11 psalms and he asked different rabbis to write commentary on each one of them. And he published a very beautiful book, which I don't have here at home. It's in CBST, which I forgot what it's called, something like Psalms of Healing or something like that, and it was a lovely idea to take this kind of old tradition and then ask contemporary rabbis to write something about each of them. I forgot what the name of the book is. And Simcha Weintraub was the editor of that project, which is a lovely project. So different traditions have identified different psalms as having different power. And sometimes you'll even have, like the Mitsuda, they like to always say, use this psalm for X, Y, or Z. Here, like this is
an index in front. There's actually
Psalm 6. This is an excellent prayer for anyone who is sick or in distress. Anyone who offers this prayer with heartfelt devotion is assured that God will accept it. It's a little too directive for me, but so there's a lot of different traditions like that. There is an index. And by the way, she also has an index of different themes of the Psalms. Like if you need something for hope or despair, or where is this? She has an index here in the beginning. I don't know if you can see awe, blessings, closeness to God, faith and trust of God, gratitude, Hallel, history and Torah, holiness, idols, joy, judgment, lies and slander, love, praise, remorse, revenge, reversal of fortune, Sabbath, suffering, and truth. And it's actually so a lot of different people have made different rubrics and there is no one that is right and the others are wrong. They're just different ways of accessing the Psalms. That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
So, Rabbi, the chatter verse here is trying to figure out the translation for Gezerah Shava.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
You have a translation for us.
Gezerah Shava, I would say it's Shava is like an equivalence. A Gezerah is like a oh boy, I'll have to look it up in my Aramaic. Gezerah Shava, it's like an equivalence, a word equivalence. I've never thought of how to translate it.
We get verdict, edict, equivalent, edict. Well, why don't we wait? We'll put that on the list for tomorrow, and you can get
Yeah. I need to. Yeah, nobody ever translates it. It's so it's like a word equivalent that's from one place to another. But let me look it up. It's Gezerah Shava. It is Aramaic, obviously based in Hebrew, but I'll look it up yeah. Good questions. All right, so shall we? Any other things for right now? Shall we go back to the translation?
Ira's had to stand up for a while.
Okay, Ira.
Good morning. So I was really fascinated by your whole explanation of how prayer got introduced. And I was thinking about how, for example, we have these prayers, that Rabbi Cohn has been writing, like a prayer for our country, a prayer for the healers, that are introduced into our service. And then I know that a prayer for our country has been sort of spreading around into other synagogues.
Exactly.
And I'm wondering if that's sort of how this happened back in the medieval times, or were prayers actually written, for one community or subset of community, and eventually just sort of spread out until it got codified.
So there is some stuff in the Mishnah and the Talmud that became kind of the background, but exactly, there's a prayer that's a paragraph of the weekday Shemona Esrei of the Amidah, for instance, that talks about enemies and blah, blah, blah. And pretty clearly it was written during the Crusades. And we think that communities in the Crusader period said this as protection from Crusades. And it just became, we all say it now, we're not under attack from the Crusaders. And it doesn't use that specific language, but that's where it comes from. So for sure, there are some prayers that come, and we know, some of them we actually know, but again, sometimes we don't. But Ruvain Hammer, and if people are really interested, I'm happy to, and especially since so much of the prayers are taken from Psalms, I can definitely spend some more time with that and explain and we'll come across other pieces of prayer and look how profound Samachti is, for instance, right? As a prayer that we at CBST use, or the Psalms of Hallel. How did Psalms of Hallel become what they are exactly? And Psalm 23. Who posted that thing about Psalm 23 that is really fantastic. Speaking of which, and then we're going to move into, unless there's a urgent question now. I got a call yesterday from Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld at Boston Hebrew College that they are starting a multi-faith Psalms project during COVID-19. And they are working with another, I'm not sure exactly which Christian group to do it. And when they heard, she saw on Facebook that we're doing this class. So the professor from the school, Professor Orr Rose, who's running that project, would like to come on to the class one day and kind of hear what we're doing, and is interested in seeing some of the personal prayers, Psalms that we're all writing. And so he's going to come sometime next week just to tell us about their project. And they're very moved and excited about what we are all doing, and totally amazed and in awe. But they're not even doing all the Psalms. They're just going to pick some. The first one they're going to do is Psalm 23. And then they're having, each week they're going to do a different psalm and invite different scholars to post about them and sing about them. And Jacob Nimi, I told him all about you. He's going to be in contact with you, by the way, and your composition. And they're going to have Christian scholars and Muslim scholars and different people. They're going to take one psalm a week for 18 weeks and then have different people post. And so it'll be really fun for us to be aware of it. And they're doing Psalm 23. So he's only doing the greatest hits. I said, we're deeper than that. We don't just want to do greatest hits. We want to go deeper. So he laughed. Okay, so let's go back to Psalm 5. It's now 10:30. Oh my goodness. Let's look at its translation. What do you have for us, Harold?
What do I have for us? I will start with our usual. I will start with altar.
Okay, so remember, one of the questions I always say is, what are the problems? And you're already starting to experience it. And it's so much fun for me to see. What are the problems in the language? And then you see how different people try to resolve them. So the first one is what Lamanatseach means. There is no, so altar very much leans towards, it's the lead. My screen is blank. Is yours?
Yes, I need to reshare this.
Okay, sorry. So altar very much sees Lamanatseach.
Yes.
The first thing is that altar answers the question. That first line is part of the psalm. It's not just a superscription or a title. It's part of the psalm. And the psalm is, Lamanatseach is lead player. And he doesn't understand what nechilot means, and he doesn't want to take a risk. So while others say it's some kind of wind instrument, he just leaves the Hebrew there. So to the lead player on nechilot, a David psalm. So he translates this phrase, Amrei ha'azina. Remember I said the words of listen well to my voice, crying out, my King and my God, for to you I pray. Now, remember, we had a lot of problems with how the Hebrew was in that verse, and he's very clear in seeing it as listen well. That ha'azina, meaning ear, the word ear, he is interpreting this as to listen well to my voice crying out. Again, we see that focus, that phrase, as Jacob pointed out to us. This is a very common way to express human longing for God. And again, this is direct speech from the speaker, from the author to the writer, to God directly, not about God. This is the intimacy of speaking right to God. Verse 4, Lord, so that's the Yud He Vav He. In the morning, you, capital Y, hear my voice. In the morning, I lay it before you and wait. For not a God, now for altar, the lower G is not the God. This is another God, or not a God of evil. So there are gods that might desire wickedness, but not you. And again, notice the parallelism. Altar gives it, by looking at altar, you can see in the English the parallelism in the Hebrew. And he's making some choices here, but it's a very easy way to see it. So, for not a God desiring wickedness are you, no evil will sojourn by you. So you see how that's a parallelism. Would be a synonymous parallelism. In other words, they're saying the same thing. The debauched take no stand in your eyes, and you hate all the wrongdoers. Now, I would say it's hard for some of us to hear what is God hating, but we want to believe, of course, that God hates what wrongdoers do. We hope, right? You destroy the pronouncers of lies, a man of blood and deceit, the Lord loathes. So the author here again is writing, what are the negatives? What is removing holiness from the world? Those things, the one who creates all holiness despises. And that is clearly giving the author comfort that surely God is not happy with those who lie, those who murder, those who are corrupt. As for me, and remember, this is again going back to the va'ani, the vav making it, just want to get that's verse
8.
So this is 8. This is the famous verse that is part of the Matovu, the va'ani. So Alter's translating the va as for me. Again, it's contrast to those verses that come before, describing all the evil in the world. As for me, Va'ani berov chasdecha, through your great kindness, your great loving kindness, avo vetecha, I enter your house. I bow to your holy temple in the fear of you. Fear is this word, iratecha, like yamim noraim, days of awe. So fear has the sense of trembling, of awesomeness, of not being an equal, but of being in sense of power. Guide me, O Lord, in your righteousness. On account of my foes, make my way straight before me. For there is nothing right in their mouths, within them falsehood. I don't know, I sure read this in the contemporary world and we live and feel like, wow, this is really describing what we are surrounded by in the world today, right? Hi, Randy.
Hi, baby.
I love the way Randy's trying to sneak in here, but she's, okay. There's nothing right in their mouths, within them falsehood. An open grave their throat, their tongue smooth talking. How much does this describe what we listen to day in and day out by the leaders of this country? Condemn them, O God, let them fall by their counsels for their many sins. Cast them off, for they have rebelled against you. So again, the description that Alter is creating here is a very powerful one. Those who are doing evil are not in the state of holiness or in God's space or the place of godliness. And so there's comfort there for Alter in this description. Great. So let's see. Do we have time to look at Fisher?
You know what? There's last two verses here that I think.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm moving too fast. Yeah, 12 and 13. Let all who shelter in you rejoice. Let them sing gladly forever. Protect them. And those who love your name exult in you. For you bless the just man. That's an amazing. Ki ata tivarech tzaddik. Because you will bless those who are just. Like a shield, you crown them with favor. So again, lots of contrasts here. And for me, it certainly jumps out all the descriptions of what the evil is that we're experiencing in the world. But I know that so let's look at Fisher and see how he deals with these concepts. Everybody with us?
Can you see it?
So yes, remember Norman Fisher is our Zen-inspired, he calls it Zen-inspired translation of the Psalms. So listen. So isn't that interesting the way, first of all, we'll notice that Fisher drops off that superscription. That's not of interest to him. The instructions to the lead player and the David piece, he takes off that. Listen, so that is listen, incline your ear toward me. Listen to my piercing cry as I pray. At daybreak, hear my voice when I order my words toward you and wait. Penny, you've got to listen. Come here, Penny, listen. Penny wants me to listen to her. For you do not take pleasure in the crooked. The heedless can never reach your courts. The arrogant, Penny, you got to be quiet here, Penny. Come on, come listen to me. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, here we go, Penny. Come on, join us here, Penny. For you do not take pleasure in the crooked. The heedless can never reach your courts. The arrogant fall away when you look at them. The wicked are distasteful to you. Liars you cut off. The violent ones, the deceivers you cast away. But as for me, the contrast verse.
Sorry, whoops.
Okay.
Empty screen here. Hold on. Okay. Here we
But
go.
as for me, this is now the famous sentence, right? But as for me, bathed in your encircling kindness, I enter your house, bow myself down before your presence in awe and wonder. Lead me into rightness against the force of my envy. Straighten me, for their mouths know not a single sincere word. Inside they are full of deception. Their throats are graves. Their tongues slide. Cast them out of me. Let them fall by their own weight all the way down, for they are your counterforce. When all who put trust in you will rejoice, will shout out their joy in your protection, will exalt in you all who love your unsayableness, for you bless the faithful, circling them round like a shield. All right, thoughts or comments?
All right, would you like me to take these down so we can?
Yeah,
Otherwise I can't really see everybody. All right. Who has a hand up? Let's see. Any thought? Okay, Jeffrey Weiss has his hand up.
Okay,
Sure.
this may sound kind of unusual, but when I heard this, I kept thinking about this is somebody talking to a king or queen. It reminds me of watching Elizabeth or King Henry VIII, where the subjects would say that to the king and queen. It reminds me of that.
Huh. Interesting. Well, for sure, that was the ancient way of seeing God, was as the King of Kings.
Sherry Allen, you raised something interesting in the chat. Do you think that the psalmist truly believes this, or is the psalmist trying to convince himself to embrace this?
I don't think we can know.
All right.
I don't think we can know.
Lisa Brown has her hand up. Oh, lots of hands. Lisa.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems that this is more internally focused, that the enemy is your internal demons, as it were. Envy is the one that gets mentioned.
And again, you'll see, isn't that interesting? You can read this psalm, and initially, those of us with modern sensibilities feel often a little with the whole discussion of enemies and evildoers. And as I keep saying, the one way to immediately get access is to say, okay, can I read this as internal evildoers, internal enemies, internal demons, so to speak? Even though I think that there's a role to play for the external ones as well. But yes, Norman Fisher definitely goes in that direction.
And Cantor Nimi raises the question about unsayableness.
I just want to add one more thing onto that. It's just how Buddhist it is.
Yep.
Acceptance of what's around you and your own process in the face of what's around you.
Yep.
The word unsayableness in Fisher, which seems to come from either the last verse or the less to. What is the Hebrew for that?
Well, he doesn't do it.
I know it's not a translation, but where does he get the unsayableness?
And all who put their trust, exalt with all your love. It looks like Ohave Shemecha which is loving your name. And I think maybe it's your name.
Right.
Because your name is unsayable. I think that's what he's doing with that Hebrew, I think.
Aura.
He doesn't give us notes, but that's what it looks like.
Right.
If you.
Yes, I still have my question from yesterday, which had to do with what does it mean? It's okay. What does it mean, that God dooms the liars and the evils, and yet,
and yet they thrive. And
yet they thrive, yes.
So I think that is, of course, the ultimate question about why do bad things happen to good people and why do bad people seem to thrive? That is a classic and profound and eternal question. I think the answer that the psalmist would provide is that we're on a timeline we don't necessarily understand, and that God works in mysterious ways, and what we see as empirically true simply isn't the only truth that's there, and we're on a timeline that we might not understand. And that's what's really hard to get, right? Because we look around and we see such evil people doing so well. But the psalmist, I think, would say, don't worry, you're seeing a sliver of God's universe. And this is where trust and faith comes in. I'm reading now, and as I've mentioned to you, I'm reading this Warsaw Rebbe's drashot that he gives for 3 years in the ghetto. And it is really hard to read and to understand where his faith comes from, because he's watching his family being murdered. He's watching the Jews being unspeakably, cruelly starved to death, even before the deportations happen. It's just a terrible. And I think that's what he teaches over and over again. We can't understand the whole universe, and we have to trust that there is a truth and a justice that's bigger than we can possibly see in our lifetimes.
And we are, I believe, at time, Rabbi.
Yes, we are at time. We'll continue tomorrow with the translations, I think.
And just one housekeeping thing. if everyone can make sure that they're reading the emails that I send, because I do attach the PDFs of the translations that we're looking at that you can have on your own. There's a long thing about the deadlines for reflections for Psalm 5, and then going back to 1 to 4, the publishing project, etc. If by any chance you're not getting the emails, let me know and I'll make sure you're on the list. And with that, would you like me to put the text back up, Julia Ostrov?
Sure, thank you.
Okay. Whoops, let me get it. Where is it? Hold on, 1 second, please. You know what, I think we know it. Why don't you start and I will get it down.
Vani berov chastecha avo vetecha eshtachavelcha kodecha ve'iratecha ma tovu ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael ma tovu ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See everybody tomorrow.
So beautiful. Thank you,
Thank you,
Julia.
Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody.